fourth panel on China and the Global South. My name is Monica Moorhead, and I'm a managing editor for Workers' World newspaper. And if anyone reads Workers' World newspaper on a consistent basis, you may have noticed that I love to write on sports and the class society. And so I just wanted to make some brief remarks pertaining to China on this. I was lucky enough to have an 18-hour layover in Beijing on my way to People's Korea in 2003 to commemorate the 45th anniversary of the founding of the Workers' Party of Korea. Beijing was then in the midst of preparing for its historic hosting of the 2008 Olympics, whose opening ceremony remains the most stunning, combining both its rich culture and state-of-the-art technology. Fast forward to the 2024 Olympics in July, where China tied the U.S. for the highest number of gold medals, with 40 each, and second behind the U.S. in total medals count. China won every gold medal in the diving competition for women and men, a first in Olympics history. This amazing achievement, amongst so many others, earned China both the admiration of millions worldwide and the ire of the U.S. and Western imperialism, so much so that Chinese athletes have been unjustly demonized as being quote-unquote dopers. Accusations of doping were a constant theme throughout these Olympics, especially leveled against Chinese swimmers. Chinese swimmers doubled their overall total of medals during the Paris Games compared to the Tokyo Olympics in 2021. Gold medals won by the Chinese male swimmers broke the stranglehold that U.S. male swimmers held in this area since the 1960s Olympics, with the exception of the 1980 Games that the U.S. boycotted. Shin Weihao, a Chinese daily journalist, stated in a post that an informed source told him that the U.S. was trying to plant evidence and frame Chinese athletes in the inextricable doping scandal during the Paris Olympics. China's Olympics showing is an amazing feat for what was once an extremely impoverished peasant country for centuries that carried out a successful workers' revolution that 75 years ago is coming October 1st. This reflects the great achievements of the Socialist Revolution, a revolution that prioritizes human needs and development, not profit. Being the second largest economy behind the U.S. and is being subjected to attacks by the anti-communist U.S. and its Western allies on every economic, political, military, and social level, including the Olympics. So anyway, we look forward to more great achievements, by the Chinese Revolution, where they make sure that everybody has the right to education, to recreation, to develop as full human beings. So anyway, that's my opening remarks. So next, I'm going to hear a virtual message from Gerald Horn, an author and historian on China, Africa, and the future.
I congratulate the working class, the Communist Party, the people in the government of the People's Republic of China on this, the 75th anniversary of the culmination of the revolutionary process in this largest of Asian nations. Of course, I have a special interest in China, having taught at the University of Hong Kong a quarter of a century ago, having written a biography of the noted African-American communist and intellectual and writer Shirley Graham Boys, who died in China in 1977, having written a number of books about her spouse, W.E.B. Boys, who visited China a number of times, both before and after 1949, and having written other books, including on Zimbabwe, Southern Africa more generally, and most recently the Black Panther Party, all of which deal to a greater or lesser extent with China. The importance of this single occasion, this 75th anniversary, was indicated recently with the September 2024 summit between the People's Republic of China and 4 dozen plus heads of state and government from Africa taking place in Beijing. This profound event promises more of the same, indicated when Vice President Harris of the United States traveled to Accra, Ghana, Lusaka, Zambia, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, with every airport she landed at either being designed and or constructed by Chinese interests. The trains from Mombasa to Nairobi, Kenya, and from Ethiopia to Djibouti are also indicative of the importance of China to African development. At this moment, when a new Cold War, or perhaps a hot peace, has erupted between China and U.S. imperialism and its allies and friends, it is apparent that more than ever, Beijing will be seeking succor and support in Africa, which in turn has driven Washington to accede finally to the long-standing demand for 2 permanent African seats at the top table of the United Nations Security Council, albeit without a veto, and as well, the recent news that President Biden will be traveling to Angola in the coming weeks in order to put his blessings on the major infrastructural project of the United States on the continent, speaking of the so-called Lobito Corridor, designed to transport the oil of Luanda, Angola, the copper of Zambia, and the cobalt of Congo to North Atlantic markets. This is ironic in light of the fact that in 1975, U.S. imperialism, in league with apartheid South Africa, sought to block Angolan independence, a diabolical plan that was only blocked by the dispatching of thousands of Cuban troops. In other words, the existence of communist-led China has forced U.S. imperialism, which is built in no small measure by dint of enslaved labor from Angola and Congo, to now be forced to disgorge concessions to Luanda and Kinshasa. Of course, we must realize that few issues unite the 2 major bourgeois parties in the United States as does hostility to Beijing. This came through in the recent presidential debate and is reflected in the so-called bipartisan Congressional Committee on China. This is reflected in important elections taking place from Pennsylvania to Montana, where hostility to Beijing is the keynote. This is reflected in the fact that the notorious Central Intelligence Agency has an entire center devoted precisely to focus on Beijing, which is quite unusual. Thus, as we go forward in this century, we continue to salute Beijing, and especially its assistance to Socialist Cuba. This aid is indicative of a brighter future for the bulk of humanity. Thank you for your attention.
Next, we're going to hear from Margaret Kimberly, who chaired one of the opening sessions. Margaret is executive editor of Black Agenda Report, and she's going to be speaking on China and multipolarity, Forum on China-Africa Cooperation in the BRICS. Margaret? Thank you all. Good afternoon. Good to see you again. And power to the people. Power to the people. Power to the people. Excellent. Very well said. my mentor, Glenn Ford, may he rest in peace, is always starting, and so I don't speak without saying the same thing. But thank you all again for being here, as we're just 2 days away from the 75th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic of China. And I would be remiss if I did not speak of what's happening in Lebanon with the continuation of Israeli and U.S. war crimes, the assassination of Hassan Nasrallah, the deaths of, as I said, nearly 200,000 people. But this is connected. We understand that this effort, imperialist effort, to wage war on the entire region of Western Asia makes this commemoration all the more important. We're not just commemorating a successful revolution, but also the beginnings of changes in power relationships around the world, which coincided with the post-war stirrings for independence across the global South. And I'm going to talk about Africa and its relationships with the People's Republic of China, which began first as China was an example of the possibility of freedom from the capitalist imperialist world. I'm very fortunate this year. I had an amazing opportunity to visit China as part of a Friends of Socialist China delegation, as guests of the China NGO Network for International Exchanges, visiting Beijing, Xizang, and Jilin. And I saw for myself why China has leapfrogged over the rest of the world in its economic development. The dedication to the principles of socialism and a commitment to worldwide cooperation has made relations with China attractive to the entire continent of Africa. Recently, 53 nations, or 54 nations in Africa, so that means every nation but one, attended the recent Forum for China-African Cooperation, known as the Forum, in Beijing. And why would they? Well, I guess a better question is, why wouldn't they? Considering the ways in which African nations are treated by the capitalist West. And here's an example. We all know that the U.S. imposed sanctions on Russia 2 years ago, but they gave no thought to the relationships, the needs of the commerce between African nations and Russia for grain, for fertilizer. And they just said, well, we're going to sanction you if you keep buying it. But there were agreements worked out that the UN representative, Linda Thomas-Greenfield, she was shaking her finger at the Africans. Deviate from this, we're going to sanction you all. So why wouldn't African nations want to get away from those toxic relationships? China's devoted to cooperation, providing debt forgiveness. That Western nation, has the World Bank and the IMF, do they ever forgive debts? I don't think so. During the forum, President Xi Jinping promised better trade relations and market access for the so-called least developed countries, including 33 on the African continent. China will voluntarily, and quote, China will voluntarily and unilaterally open its markets wider, giving LDCs that have diplomatic relations zero tariff treatment for 100% tariff lines, unquote. And so we have the possibility of something new. And we hear about the debt trap and China's, they just take stuff from Africa. There's that, I'll get to some of that. But there is nothing like this willingness to change the structures of economic relationships around the world. Now there are contradictions, of course, because these 50 African nations are all very different. So, for example, all these heads of state showed up. So you would have Rwanda and Uganda there, but they've spent decades violently pillaging the Democratic Republic of Congo. but all three were there. There's a newly formed alliance in Sahel states, Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso. They were under attack. In the ECOWAS, which is supposed to be an economic movement, but it's under the thumb of the U.S., we even threatened military intervention against those same countries. So we have the Western stooge nations and those who are seeking independence that were all present. And I want to point out, if I talk about African nations, I think we should always mention Eritrea, the one country that has maintained its commitment to socialism, which is why it's always under attack. It's why it's considered a slur. It's called the North Korea of Africa. As if North Korea, the DPRK, is some kind of weird slur. Eritrea is just a country that has maintained its independence, that doesn't want to take loans from the World Bank, and it suffers because of sanctions. But it's important, very important, that China maintain its commitment to having more equitable relationships and not be like the US and Canada and Europe and merely extract. Chinese construction companies in DRC, Democratic Republic of Congo, for example, have agreed to invest up to $7 billion in infrastructure projects as part of their agreements in mining there in the DRC, which is very important. What happens in the DRC is a human rights catastrophe. It's, we've all seen the images of men, women, and little children just with a bucket and a shovel, mining minerals and resources that other people use to get rich. So I think it's very important that we keep an eye on this. And the Chinese corporations live up to these commitments to change these relationships so there's not merely extraction from that country. So the theme of the forum was flowery title, Joining Hands to Advance Modernization and Build a High-Level China-Africa Community with a Shared Future. Great title. But it encapsulates how China is approaching nations of the global South. And that explains why African nations want to join the BRICS. Originally Brazil, Russia, China and South Africa, now Iran, Ethiopia, UAE, and Egypt. And the BRICS have yet to create their own currency. But just this effort, beginnings of an effort to escape dollar domination and to fight against the terrorism of the US sanctions regime is enough to create endless screeds against China and against these countries which are just seeking to live free from domination. And I realize I should mention coming up is the anniversary of the founding of AFRICOM, the US Africa Command. Founded in 2008, the last few months of the George W. Bush administration, really ramped up under Obama. Now almost every African country, except for 2 or 3, have a military relationship with the US. Why? They were trying to stop China's relationship, economic relationship with the African continent. And as you probably know, the US has divided the whole world into command structures, NORTHCOM, SOUTHCOM, INDO-PACOM, and AFRICOM. And as part of the the Black Alliance for Peace, we are having our annual month of action against AFRICOM. And so I wanted to mention that too, because that is also connected with China's relationships. And there's something else that occurred to me that doesn't appear to be connected, but I think it is. Secretary of State Blinken, a couple of weeks ago, attacked RT, the Russian-based network, and said it was a tool of Russian propaganda and it should be sanctioned even more. That was not surprising. But he also singled out an African network called African Street.
It's a platform, it's a very good platform, and he said they were Russian propagandists without any evidence. And it was very odd. It was like, why would he turn on African Street, which has now been deplatformed by Meta, all the Facebook platforms, deplatformed by YouTube, taken off of Stripe, so far still on X, Twitter, but who knows for how long. And I think it's connected with China's outreach to African nations, Russia's outreach to African nations, that this online platform, which dares to present a different narrative, is turned into an enemy, and they seek to destroy it. Because if people have even the most basic information, then you will question U.S. actions in Africa, or actually all over the world. So I thought that was important to bring up in talking about China's relationships with African nations. The U.S. and Europe want to cut off those relationships, as it does for the rest of the world. They don't want African nations to have a different relationship. And as African people throughout the diaspora, they don't want us to have different relationships. And I think it's important to mention not just the nations of the African continent, but the relations of the African diaspora, of Dr. Horn referred to Shirley Graham Du Bois, and there has been constant, on the part of revolutionaries, this urge to connect with China, to see China as this example, which is why, in general, anti-Chinese propaganda is so dangerous. It's an effort to indoctrinate. It's an effort to stop revolutionary activity. And so W.E.B. Du Bois visiting China, and Paul Robeson visiting China, and Huey Newton visiting China, it's all connected. It tells you how important it is that African people maintain these relationships, see China for ourselves, and judge for ourselves. And the fact that that is something that is condemned so strongly tells us quite a lot. So I brought in a lot, but I know I'm approaching my 7 minutes, so I will wrap it up here. Long live the People's Republic of China. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Margaret. We're going to have a little bit of a change in the agenda here since Omawale Clay is not here. We're now going to hear from Larry Holmes, who's the first secretary of Focus World Party, on the defense of China, his solidarity with Palestine, and then we're going to end with the Charles Chu message. Larry?
Good evening, comrades and friends. First, on behalf of the Central Committee of Workers' World Party, we would like to extend our fraternal greetings to the Communist Party of China on this historic occasion. I think it's relevant, even though our event is about China, to ask ourselves, what should we make out of the assassination of the leader of Hezbollah 2 days ago in Beirut? I think it's a warning to the world from the warmongers. This was so important to them. I'm not forgetting the genocide in Gaza, but this event coming at this time. They dropped 80 bombs on a neighborhood in Beirut. 2,000-pound bombs. One of these military analysts on CNN said The only thing bigger they could have dropped would have been a tactical nuclear weapon. And these 2,000-pound bombs were given to Israel by who? Last October, the U.S. gave them thousands of them. I forget the exact number, but thousands of them. I do not buy for a second this idea that, well, we didn't know about it. They didn't tell, the Secretary of War over here. I think that's BS. If they weren't down with it, they could have stopped it.
Of course.
The message was just not from Netanyahu. It was from Washington, D.C. It was from the Pentagon. And I'll tell you what I think is the relevance to China and the whole world. Everything in the world struggle is connected. Everything is dots all together. They wanted to let the world know that you don't have to speculate about a wider war. You don't have to lie to us about we don't want one and we're having all this diplomacy trying to stop it. That's not what's really going on. The wider war is already here. It's already here, comrades. It's not just against the Palestinians. Although they're the main target of it now, it's not just Hezbollah and the Lebanese and, the resistance forces in West Asia, and of course Iran. It's against People's Korea, Cuba, Venezuela, the struggling people of Africa who, as you might notice, recently have been throwing the colonialists and the imperialists out. It's against Russia through the Ukraine, and ultimately, it's against China. It's against China. Why? Why is this? Is it because China supports the Palestinians? That's part of it, but that's a small reason. China has on a number of occasions brought the Palestinian groups together to try to help them forge unity. Very, very important. But the bigger reason is because China is so powerful now.
Yeah.
It's so powerful and so developed, and its people are rising up. And this has changed the balance of forces in the world. But we need to be very clear about something. China does not want war. China wants peace. It wants to continue its development in peace. It wants to help the world develop in peace, especially the people of the global south, who have been the big victims of imperialism and colonialism. It wants to help them. But U.S. imperialism does not want peace. It doesn't want China to develop in peace. It doesn't want the world that it does not control to develop. And this is the problem. And what this murder in Beirut tells us, and the almost 1,000 people who have been murdered in Lebanon over the past couple of weeks, and the genocide in Gaza, what it tells us is that U.S. imperialism is willing to go to almost any lengths, unimaginable lengths of violence and terror to maintain its empire, which is crumbling. They're willing to flirt with World War III, which could mean the end of all life on planet Earth. And when an empire is crumbling, that's when it's most desperate and dangerous. That's when it's most likely to resort to violence. And this is what we're witnessing, comrades. There are some in the ruling class here who are afraid of war, a wider war, a world war. They don't think the U.S. will win. As a matter of fact, they think it will hasten the demise of U.S. imperialism, and we think that they're right about that. they like to maintain U.S. hegemony by other means, you know. But comrades, whoever that is in the ruling class, they're losing. They're not winning. They're not in the driver's seat. It's the warmongers who are in the driver's seat. And so we see the people rising up all over the world against the empire. We see the people demonstrating in the streets over the murder of the leader of Hezbollah. Actually, as I was leaving home, I saw on social media that there was a demonstration of thousands of people in Baghdad. They had entered the green zone and were trying to get into the U.S. Embassy. And I'm sure you know about the demonstration everywhere, particularly in West Asia, but around the world, shows you that, you know, this is a punch, but they're not going to take it lying down. As a matter of fact, it's going to wave on the resistance. And, of course, the countries that are under attack, in particular China, that are in the crosshairs of U.S. imperialism, they're going to fight back. They can defend themselves. They can defend themselves. But we have to ask ourselves this, comrades. Are we going to just leave it up to people in other places? To China? They're willing to do it. They'll do what they have to do. But are we just going to leave it up to them? Especially those of us who happen to be at the centers of world imperialism, particularly here in the U.S., which they used to call the belly of the beast. We can't do that. That's not right. We have to seriously consider what our responsibilities as anti-imperialist revolutionaries are. And we have to shoulder that responsibilities. And we gotta do whatever it takes. You see, the people of the world, they're demanding this of us. History is demanding us. Saving this planet, if they could talk, it is demanding this of us. That we do whatever is necessary, however we need to do it, however long it takes, and it better not take too long for the anti-imperialist, anti-war forces to get so big and so strong that we can shut the world down to stop war. What other choice do we have? We've got to get away from complacency if that's an issue. I know that those of us here are doing on a day-to-day basis whatever we can. We've got to get away from, you know, our routine, what they call routinism. You know, it's almost like a semi-conscious feeling that, yes, that needs to be done, but somebody else can do it. You know, we need to, sometimes I think we have a partial kind of disconnect, a partial, you know, denial of what's happening, perhaps because we feel somewhat powerless. But all those things, we gotta push them aside now. We gotta push them aside, and we gotta figure out what we're gonna do. I think, I'm not sure, that Comrade Maduro in Venezuela a couple of months ago called for an international united front against imperialism. I'm not sure whether it's just something that he floated or whether it was real and how he's following up on that. But I'll tell you, comrades, if there was ever a time for that, and I'm not talking about just a name. It's easy to have a name. I'm talking about something with flesh and blood and strength and power that's real. If there was ever a time for that, it's now. I'm thinking about a month from now. About a month from now, the BRIC countries are meeting in Russia. Last week of October. And that's good. And you know, people have talked about it from this podium, and we can talk about that. But again, we can't just leave it up to the BRICS to push U.S. imperialism back, to marginalize it, to diminish its hegemony. We've got to do something. The masses have to do something. The working class has to do something. They have to do something decisive, and a lot of us are convinced that they can, and those who are not convinced better get with it. Long live the People's Republic of China. Long live the struggle for socialism. Defend China.
And lastly, in this panel, we're going to hear a virtual message from Charles Hsu, who's with the Chow Collective, speaking on 75 years of Chinese solidarity with Palestine, El Qasr, flood, and People's War in the New Era.
Greetings. My name is Charles Hsu, and I am appearing here as a writer and researcher with the Chow Collective. We are a diaspora Chinese media collective that was formed in 2020 to challenge U.S.-led imperialist aggression against the People's Republic of China and to educate Western-led audiences about China's ongoing process of socialist construction and international solidarity. As such, it's my distinct pleasure to join you all virtually to celebrate the 75th anniversary of the founding of the People's Republic on October 1st, 1949. As we commemorate that event, which marks the culmination of one cycle of anti-imperialist resistance and augured the dawn of another, we also, of course, are approaching 1 year since the mass prison break known as Operation Flood. The subsequent year of Zionist genocide in Gaza, unparalleled in its depravity, is, as we well know, simply a continuation and intensification of a colonial process that predated even the Nakba of 1948. And it's notable that barely a year separated those two events in 1948 and 1949. One was the emphatic triumph of an organic people's war for self-determination in one of the world's oldest continuous surviving civilizations. The other, the violent and anachronistic implantation of an alien settler colonial regime with no legitimate claims to a niche of Palestinian land. And since the United Nations General Assembly has just concluded right there in New York, affording, of course, a platform today for the right war criminal Benjamin Netanyahu, it's worth noting that while the 1947 UN partition plan, in fact, midwifed the settler state of Israel into existence, that same UN went to war under U.S. leadership against People's China just 2 years later and continued to exclude it for another 2 decades. Indeed, the Nakba and the founding of the PRC may have been separated in time by only a year, but geographically they were sundered by the entirety of the world's largest continent. Our distance was no barrier to revolutionary hand in solidarity. Indeed, as Chairman Mao told the Wednesday delegation of the Palestine Liberation Organization in 1965, quote, "Imperialism is afraid of China and of the Arabs. Israel and Formosa are bases of imperialist data. You are the gate of the great continent, and we are the leader. They created Israel for you, and Formosa for us. Their goal is the same." Now, the reason that delegation was received with state honors as early as 1965 was precisely because China was the first non-Arab country to recognize the PLO, and indeed was the most generous military sponsor and most strident diplomatic champion of the Palestinian cause throughout its first decade of organized armed struggle. Indeed, Yasser Arafat described China as, quote, "the biggest influence in supporting our revolution and strengthening its perseverance." And George Habash, the founder of the Popular Fund for the Liberation of Palestine, described China as, quote, "our best friend." And indeed, through all the advances and reversals of the 1967 war, also known as the Nakba, of Black September in Jordan, the Lebanese Civil War, the First and Second Intifadas, and the capitulation of Oslo and the accompanying normalization of Zionism globally. China's contribution from that time, in fact, continues to reverberate today. Above all, we see this in the training that was received by earlier generations of Palestinian fighters in the theory and methods of asymmetric people's war against a technologically superior enemy backed by the global hegemon. These were methods that were informed and refined in the crucible of the Communist Party of China's own decades-long struggle of tunnel boycott, which propagated from China's war of resistance against Japan to Korea and Vietnam's wars of liberation from U.S. imperialism, and thenceforth through direct training to Hezbollah and then to Hamas as precisely the strategic net that they need to withstand Israel's genocidal assaults on Gaza and now on Lebanon. At a broader political level, the CPC never forgot its history of United Front tactics. First, pausing hostilities to unite with the Kuomintang against Japanese colonialism, and then, after defeating Japan, allying with the KMT's own left wing and with other democratic forces against KMT rule itself. China was drawn precisely on this deep and historically informed understanding of national unity as a prerequisite to national liberation when it brokered the Beijing Unity Declaration between 14 Palestinian factions, including Fatah, Hamas, Islam Jihad, and the PFLP this past July. Indeed, despite maintaining official ties with both Israel and the Palestinian Authority, the legacy of China's historical role has garnered sufficient trust from all parties involved to secure an agreement that simultaneously affirms the legitimacy of the PLO as a vehicle and the necessity for armed struggle as a method in the liberation of the Palestinian people. The Palestinians and their regional allies and acts of resistance have, in fact, more than repaid China for these historical contributions. They've done so by broadcasting to the world their ingenious tactics of resistance to the Zionist onslaught, which have featured, among others, Chinese-made DJI drones, Hongdian 8 anti-tank missiles, Xiaomi mobile phones, and Hikvision cameras. In so doing, the Palestinians have revived anti-imperialist consciousness and popular interest among China's people in their own country's foundational history of People's War waged against similarly daunting odds. And here, I want to conclude by noting that the global solidarity movement has also done its part, even and especially right here, in the heart of the Imperial Accord, where the U.S. student intifada of April and May, which kicked off not far from here at Columbia University, drew innumerable comparisons among Chinese netizens to the May 4th movement of 1919. Now, like the recent student intifada, that movement too was initially involved by the forces of reaction. But as my comrade Xiongdia of the Tricontinental Institute pointed out, it ultimately planted the seeds for the founding of a great revolutionary party just 2 years later, and its ultimate triumph in the founding of New China 3 decades on. And as we gather here to celebrate that event, let this be a reminder of how brutal and protracted the struggle will be, but also how momentous the final victory that awaits us. Thank you so much.
Okay, this officially ends the fourth panel, and I want to thank you for your patience. We're now coming up to our last panel. That's going to be chaired by Danny Icon. So maybe you can stretch for a minute or two while we